Hello and welcome to Single Case Subject Research Design. My name is Paul Deutsch, and I am a doctorate student at Viterbo University. One thing we're going to be looking at today is the purpose and function of a single case study as a research tool. When working with humans, consistent outcomes is the holy grail. Often proclaimed but elusive when a clinician begins to apply an intervention. It has been in this inconsistency in outcomes that has determined or demanded a research approach that accounts for some subject variability and pursues a pursuit approach to teasing outcomes out of subject intervention and data. Some of the reasons for using a single case subject before we get into its definition is that it accounts for inconsistencies of subject experience noted in other designs. It does account for some subject variability, and it allows researchers to sort out outcomes from subject intervention data. It is this ability to sample and look at and then evaluate in a graphic as well as schematic way the outcomes from interventions that has made it an important tool in determining whether or not skills that are developed in research can be applied clinically. So let's get on with the definition. The definition is a single subject design, or SSRD as we'll refer to at times, involves an intensive study of a single individual or sometimes a single group over time after exposure to a treatment or intervention. Nock et al. Is in 2007 developed an extensive review of SSRD, and if you go into looking at his stuff, you're going to find that there's a lot of consistent reporting by them. They found that by targeting a single individual, researchers can account for the presence of variables in the more specific of intervention type and application. Cohen, prior to Nock in 1988, points out that a single case research designs are diverse and powerful set of procedures useful for demonstrating causal relations among clinical phenomenon. Okay, it's that causality in causal relations. So they're able to tease out these small definitive little ideas. It is that the author's intent is to set forth a description of these powerful procedures, and that's one thing we're going to do today is pull these things together and reflect on these methods for developing, retaining, and working understanding of their application. And like I said, Cohen pointed out that the single case research designs are a diverse and powerful set of procedures. And I think that's really important to note. That's why I made another slide of it after saying it, is that it is for demonstrating that causal relations. That cannot be lightly stated. Through this process that we're going to talk about, you're going to be able to see how that plays out. Some of the elements that are involved in SSRD, it begins with a question, of course, like most research design processes do. You take that question and refine it down so as to be able to isolate a subject or a group of subjects that are then collected with a unifying behavior or conditions, right? So these are the things that are present that that are elements of the question that the researchers targeted for intervention and analysis. Erford talks about that in the textbook. The textbook subjects are then monitored or surveyed to determine the prevalence of the target issues prior to the introduction of the intervention. This is the first baseline, or A as it's referred to in Kasdan in 2003. After A is established, an intervention is administered. So an intervention has to be, of course, determined and preliminary testing done so as to see if it has any effect or presence to the subject or subjects. That's going to be referred to as intervention, or B in this case. And during the intervention phase, the subject is monitored. After the intervention has been administered, a new baseline is then taken of the subject and changes are noted. Second baseline is administered and determined, and that is another A position. So what we have is an A-B-A application. And one of the ways to kind of talk about that, there's two. First of which is just looking at it in terms of a graphic model. If we check, we have a baseline A, and then we're going to administer a treatment, and then we're going to recheck that behavior to see whether or not the treatments had any effect on the behavior, and in a sense checking it through a process of monitoring. So let's take a second, and we're going to look at an example of an ABA design that's been put to use in Cox by Cox in 2011, and it was excerpted from the Journal of Effective Teaching. The Absent Graduate Student, an ABA single subjects experiment of online discussion participation. The question that was established is, can an intervention improve a graduate student's online participation? They identified a subject within the graduate cohort, and then identified this subject as having very poor performance with relation to this online class. The subject was identified and a baseline was set. So they baselined that subject's behavior and found it and administered a numeric value to that participation, with 0 being non-existent and 5 being a very effective participation. The first baseline was poor responses to online assignments and comments on other people's work. Those were the two qualifying behaviors. The intervention was administered over the third. So the first 3 weeks they monitored the student's behavior. The second set of 3-week period they administered an intervention by the professor, and that began with the encouraging the student to online participation in emails and demonstrating interest in the student's contribution to the course, compliments on posts, and encouraging feedback on assignments. The professor did that for 3 weeks, and then that behavior, those interventions, were withdrawn from the student. The subject's performance was tracked post-intervention and noted a marked increase in participation and improvement performance. Ergo, you could say that the intervention was effective. The graphing of that particular study ends up looking like this. We have a level of participation 0 to 5. And on the a-axis or the vertical axis here, we have the time is represented over time. So we have the identifying marker for monitoring the behavior, and then we have time on this axis. And you can see that in the first 3 weeks, the student's behavior was quite poor, and then we see a marked trend during the intervention period, and then post-intervention, when the intervention's withdrawn, we see the baseline to be sustaining despite the removal of the intervention. A conclusion could be made there that the intervention was effective. So like I was just saying there, the dependent variables laid out on the vertical axis, the horizontal axis is an indication of passage of time. Okay. Kazan also points out that the condition lines indicate that the condition has changed, and the data points represented in the data collected throughout the study. So those condition lines, these are the condition lines, all right? And the data points exist inside that generate those lines. So a point is related to each. So we now have a definition of it. We have some graphic examples. We have a practical example of it. And what I'd like for you to do now is break into some small groups and generate a behavior from your experience, from either your clinical experience or your personal experience that you believe might be susceptible to any kind of an intervention. And then apply an ABA design model to that issue. As you're doing this, there's some questions I'd like you to kind of keep in mind. How difficult was it to narrow the target behavior? Right? Because we got to get it down to something that is susceptible not only to the intervention, but is easy to monitor and to track. What would have helped in narrowing this process? So let's just continue to be aware of what it takes to get the question down to a reasonable size. List the interventions you didn't settle on, and what were some of the challenges the group faced in applying the model. If you get time, go ahead and mock up a graph of your findings. Okay, just as a way of kind of understanding the way you would lay that data out. Okay, now that we've come back from the activity, what were some of the findings that you all came up with? Let's take some time to process those and to figure out how best to graph a few of these ideas. Great. In conclusion, let's kind of pull this together. SSRD is a clear and focused way to test for and present data related to the efficacy of strategic behavioral interventions. Okay? It just really is a process of you have the behavior, you have an intervention, you mix the two together, what's the outcome? It's straightforward. It allows us to make some very basic understandings of behavior and intervention interplay. It is a systemic method of assessment with an experimental manipulation, which allows the researcher to test the causal effects of a treatment. We talked about that at the beginning, that causal causal interaction, and Kazan went on to further illustrate that idea. Limitations to this, which there always are, right? Design models are inherently limited at some way or another. Without several ABA variations, Cox found it would be difficult to draw causation from that data. So their own study, the one we cited, was very limited by its ability to call for exact causation. All right. And he also felt that if you were able to survey the subject and understand more deeply their motivations, then you might be able to triangulate better how best to motivate the subject. So once again, understanding the question helps us narrow down and be specific about the intervention that we would apply on it. And bad outcomes inside of ABA processes often challenge the research team to go back and reevaluate their question because they may have been too broad, they may have missed some avenue of investigation, they may have selected subjects in error. So all these things fit together, and ABA is nice for that it reveals its inconsistencies and its problems. So in closing, I think it's really important to understand that the counselors, having left the profession or left academia as they've moved out into private and clinical practice, often rely on other people's research, either in training seminars or maybe a book or magazine articles, online information, and don't spend as much time as I would believe necessary to analyze the data and know exactly the source of the information that they're getting and maybe basing future interventions on. So it's important that clinicians can easily review and interpret and implement research outcomes. SSRD is a proven method to improve this process. It's graphically represented. It's easy to understand the question, the intervention, the results. And I think that that's a positive aspect about SSRD, and look forward to seeing more research and maybe doing some of my own in the future. Thank you for your time.